Hello, it's James with Gas, Gas, Gas. A desperate attempt to introduce primary FRCA teaching to the world that isn't bland, isn't obsessed with monetization, and gets to the point without too much piffle in between. Today, we are going to have a look at the arterial line waveform. Hopefully everyone's reasonably familiar with this. There are a number of things to talk about, particulars to how it relates to the hemodynamics currently going on inside your patient. As with any Viva question, depending on if the Viva survives the Royal College, you draw a diagram first and then progressively discuss features of it as you go along. So it's important to have some nice straight axes. I've cheated by using a computer. And the arterial line waveform has time along the bottom in seconds, and then pressure in millimeters of mercury up the top. First things, you need to identify some relevant pressures. So we've got systolic pressure here, which is probably about 120. And then diastolic pressure lurking down here, we'll call it 80. Arguably then, this axis is not going to be a 0 down here because the scale will be all wrong. So you could put a 6 there, and you could put a 140 there to keep people happy. Beyond this, there are a few other things to label, i.e. where does systole begin, where does diastole begin, etc, etc. So your systole occurs down here, naturally. Your diastole occurs at the cessation of the first downward inflection. By that virtue, just to make things a bit clearer for everyone, we'll just pop an extra line down in here. So we can say that diastole is also there. Lovely. Then they might ask you, oh yes, but well doctor, where does the aortic valve open? And quite naturally you can figure this out because we have systole and diastole already labelled. So the aortic valve must open at systole. And it also naturally should close in diastole. You could make argument or mention here that, however, a pathological aortic valve, either regurgitating, stenosed or sclerosed, may subsequently not completely open or completely close. So I'm going to pause it there. So moving on to a few other little bits and bobs to do with this waveform. You can infer some information about myocardial contractility depending upon the shape of your trace. So let's just put an extra line down in here that comes down here, and we'll put our dichrotic notch a bit lower down. Excuse the change in pen thickness. So the pressure wave delivered by the myocardium into the aorta finishes here, as we know, with diastole and comes down. So this is the volume ejected by the aorta as demonstrated by this waveform. It's important to remember that this bit of the waveform is coming about because of the elastic contractility of the aorta, i.e. your valve is closed and you're getting a spring back of elasticity against that valve that subsequently leads to an increase in pressure in the aorta as it bounces around a little bit, is how I imagine it. So why is this relevant? So the area under this curve, AUC, is equal to stroke volume. Okay, first useful, interesting bit of information. The second bit of information that can be gleaned slightly more visually than the area under the curve, which really a computer should be doing, is the gradient. Let's do it like this, I think. This gradient. Another important gradient is this one. I'm just going to put a dotted line there so that I can go back to my standard flavour of writing. And this is going to be myocardial. Contractility. Which you can think of as the steeper the gradient, the more pressure per unit time over time. And obviously you say that is seconds and that is millimeters of mercury in your exam. Oh, that's pesky, isn't it? There we go. So that's one useful number, and that can shift depending on how your myocardium is behaving and equally what your aortic valve is like in terms of resistance of ejection to that myocardial contraction. Perhaps a bit less clearly is this one, and this is to do with perhaps the flaccidity of your arterial vasculature. So a steeper gradient here down, if we imagine up and down, it lends itself towards a lower SVR. So that pressure wave that the aorta keeps going, the Wing-Kessel effect, that elasticity, the aorta isn't as stretched as much because it's flaccid. The rest of your arterial vasculature might be more flaccid, subsequently meaning that the stroke volume is dumped into the aorta with little change in shape. We'll talk a little bit more about systemic vascular resistance in the arterial line waveform trace in a moment. I've been a terrible doctor and I've not told you, but you may have thought it, that this fellow is called the dicrotic notch. The jury is not 100% in on what the dicrotic notch is truly caused by. I have done a bit of reading about it, and if you dig deep enough, it comes about that no one really knows, as I understand it. If someone has further information on this, I'd love to hear. It would be a great one to tease and confuse medical students about in the future. And there's also perhaps a wiggly line that needs to go somewhere across this whole shebang, although it is not accurate. I'm going to do it there, and that would be your mean arterial pressure, which is the one that we actually really care about, if we're all being honest. Okay, sounds reasonable. That would probably get you making some pretty good forward progress in an exam situation. So moving on, we've got a few more examples of the arterial pressure waveform and what these may or may not be. So, being able to draw these in an exam, you might be asked to draw one or two of them, probably not, they probably won't have enough time, but it might come up in discussion afterwards, or in an OSCE they might show you pictures of these and ask you to figure out what's going on. So you can either learn them by rote, or you can work to try and figure it out as you go based on common sense. So common sense, our first one, we know that the gradient up is poor, so the gradient that way is pretty non-steep, and equally it's got quite a rounded top. So from these you can infer that ejection from the start of systole to the end of systole is taking a longer time, and things that cause that would be aortic stenosis, chiefly. You could also argue that failing myocardial contractility in either a failing heart or a heart that has been exposed to a internal milieu that impairs the function of your myocardium could also present like this. And when I say internal milieu bother, you can think of it as in drugs circulating in the patient that are messing with how the myocardial muscle contracts, the electrolyte state in the patient impairing contraction, and then, although perhaps considered also an electrolyte, the acid-base state of the patient. If they're very acidotic, myocardial contractility is impaired. Metabolically, there's no glucose. If they're super cold, all these things impair the contractility of your myocardium and can lead to a sluggish-looking arterial waveform line. So this is aortic stenosis. Ooh! I don't want to make this too long and waffly, but it's good to try and think about things that mess the myocardium up in an organised manner, so electrolytes, drugs, metabolic nature, etc., etc. You could also squeeze in mechanical stuff there, like an obstructed SVC. So this fellow is described as bifid. We love bifid. You have bifid teeth, bifid P waves, and bifid arterial line waveforms. So we've got a dichotic notch. It's quite a bit further down, and therefore we've got two pressure waveforms. And you've got to think, well, why on earth has that happened? We know that systole has definitely started there, and we know that this is the marker of diastole beginning. So unlikely to have two dichotic notches, that would be weird, so therefore it has to be something else amiss. We know that the aortic valve opens here, closes there, apparently. However, in this case, what's happened is the ejection of blood into the aorta has happened here. Excuse the knocking. And then the assumption is that on isovolumetric relaxation, etc., in that end bit of systole, that the aortic valve would close and lead to ongoing forward flow in the aorta. However, it fails to close in this situation. So this rebound lurking here is actually where blood has refilled some of the LV, gone back. And then you get this phase of elastic contractility. Spring back, let's call it spring back. I'm not very technical. And then our last friend, the two things I'm trying to describe to you somewhat in these two waveforms is, one, the angle there versus perhaps the angle across there, and the position of your dichotic notch. So these typically define a low SVR and a high SVR. Why? a circulation that is quite flaccid and lax, i.e. our lower SVR state. It's going to promptly dump blood from that systolic ejection into your arterial vasculature, and it's going to hose in with minimal resistance. Therefore, the pressure wave drops off very rapidly. Remember, this is just a representation of pressure in an artery. The dichrotic notch drops off, and the basis for this isn't 100% clear, but the dichrotic notch is due to pressure waves in the aorta due to its elasticity. Less elasticity means that it's probably going to occur at a lower pressure. Wouldn't quote me hard on that. Whereas a high SVR state, so this fellow over here, if you're trying to squeeze blood into a system that's quite high pressure, that pressure is going to be maintained over a longer period of time, and your jazzed up, love the word jazzed up, and tight vasculature is going to respond with more vigour to a pressure stimulus that's gone through it, because it's tighter. Therefore, if you apply pressure to it, it's going to be a bit more elastic, and it's going to rebound. It's going to maintain a higher pressure over a longer period of time. So that is your arterial lines. They might then subsequently ask you about pulse contour analysis, so Pico, Lidco, all that sort of madness, whereby it does some clever fancy stuff to work out the area under the curve by breaking down this bit into some sort of sinusoidal wave pattern. I'll go over it in a different podcast, vodcast, whatever you might want to call it, and perhaps we can talk about that in a bit more detail. But broadly speaking, you would say, yes, using Fourier transformation, the systolic component of the arterial line waveform is broken down and its area calculated. This is used to look for stroke volume variation and enable cardiac output monitoring, and further information can be gained in SVR. And hopefully, by the time you've said something like that, the examiners will be thinking about the next question and you'll have got all the points. So, thank you very much for listening. This is my first attempt at doing this. Naturally, I'm probably going to get a bit better. All a bit of fun. Thank you for having a look at Gas, Gas, Gas.